The gavel fell with a sound like a bone snapping, the dry wood of the auction block vibrating under the weight of the judge's indifference. Sarah stood on the raised platform, the wind whipping her thin calico skirts against her legs, a bitter April chill cutting through the fabric. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the men with their narrowed eyes and their calculations, nor at the women who stood on the edge of the mercantile porch, their faces tight with a mixture of pity and a deeper, uglier relief that it wasn't them. Her father's debts had been a black hole, and today the law had come to collect the only thing left of value in the Miller name. Sarah was 24, a widow of 2 years who had returned to a bankrupt homestead, only to find that in this territory, a woman was often treated as part of the real estate. The judge cleared his throat, the sound wet and impatient. He didn't see a woman who could balance a ledger or mend a fence. He saw a liability that needed a custodian to satisfy the bank's lien. The bidding started low, a mockery of a life, $5 from a man who smelled of sour mash even from 10 feet away. $7 from a widower looking for a mother for 6 children and a cook who wouldn't complain about the draft in his sod hut. Sarah kept her chin level, her eyes fixed on the distant jagged line of the Tetons. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Then, a voice cut through the low murmurs, a voice like grinding stones, $50. The crowd went silent. At the back of the throng, leaning against a hitching post with a stillness that was more threatening than a drawn pistol, stood Silas Vane. He was a man made of hard angles and shadows, his face obscured by the brim of a sweat-stained Stetson. Silas didn't move, didn't smile, didn't even look at the judge. He just waited. $50 was more than most men in this county saw in a season, and it was more than enough to silence the drunks and the desperate. Sarah felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the wind. Silas Vane owned the Broken Ridge, a sprawling, lonely stretch of land that people said was cursed by the ghost of his father's failures. He was a man who lived in silence, a man who had buried his wife and child 5 years ago and hadn't spoken more than 10 words at a time since. The judge hesitated, looking for another bid, but the silence held. Going once, twice, sold to Mr. Vane. Sarah was led down the steps, her knees trembling, though she forced her stride to remain steady. Silas didn't offer a hand. He didn't even look her in the eye. He simply turned toward his wagon and jerked his head once. Sarah climbed into the high seat, her hands clenching her small satchel, the only thing she owned. Silas stepped up beside her, the springs groaning under his weight, and snapped the reins. They left the town behind without a word, the sound of the wagon wheels on the hard-packed dirt the only conversation between them. The town of Bitter Creek faded into a smudge of gray on the horizon, and Sarah realized with a sickening jolt of her heart that she was now bound to a stranger who had bought her like a prize heifer. The silence lasted for 3 hours. The road to the Broken Ridge was a climb, the air growing thinner and colder as the ponderosa pines crowded the trail. Silas drove with a singular focus, his gloved hands steady on the leather lines. He was a large man, his shoulders filling the space beside her, smelling of cedar smoke and old leather. Sarah waited for him to speak, to demand something, to explain the terms of her servitude, but he remained a statue. By the time they pulled into the yard of the ranch, the sun was dipping behind the peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley. The ranch house was a low, sturdy thing of hewn logs and riverstone, looking as though it had grown out of the earth itself. It was clean but lonely, the windows dark. Silas hopped down and unhitched the team, leaving her sitting in the wagon. She didn't wait for an invitation. She climbed down, her boots hitting the dirt with a firm thud, and followed him toward the barn. He stopped at the door, turning his head just enough for her to see the hard line of his jaw. "The house is open," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in her chest. "Kitchen's through the main room. There's flour and salt pork. I'll be in the barn." He didn't ask if she was hungry. He didn't ask if she was tired. He simply expected her to function. Sarah entered the house, the air inside smelling of stale ash and cold grease. It was a man's house, functional and devoid of any softness. She found the lamp, trimmed the wick, and struck a match. The light revealed a kitchen that was surprisingly organized, though thick with dust. She saw the ledger sitting on a small desk in the corner, its edges curled. Habit made her drift toward it. Her father had been a drunk, but he had taught her numbers, and she had kept the books for the local mercantile for 3 years before his death. She glanced at the open page. The handwriting was cramped and frustrated, the numbers trailing off into erasures that had nearly torn the paper. Silas Vane might be a king on his own land, but his books were a disaster of unpaid debts and miscalculated interest. She closed the book quietly. She wouldn't touch it yet. That night she made a simple meal of fried pork and biscuits, the heat from the iron stove finally thawing the marrow of her bones. When Silas came in, he took his plate to the table and ate in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Sarah sat opposite him, her own plate untouched. "I can work, Mr. Vane," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her throat. "I'm not a decorative piece. I can cook, I can mend, and I can handle a team." He looked up then, his eyes a pale, startling gray, like the sky before a blizzard. "I didn't buy a worker," he said bluntly. "I bought a wife. The bank won't extend credit to a bachelor. They think a married man is a stable man. You stay here, you keep the house, you stay out of the way. That's the arrangement." He stood up, leaving his empty plate on the table, and walked out to the porch. Sarah watched him through the window, a dark silhouette against the rising moon. He hadn't bought her for her company or her labor. He had bought her for the appearance of respectability. It was a cold realization, but it brought with it a flicker of defiance. If he wanted a wife in name only, she would give him that, but she wouldn't be a ghost in her own life. 3 days passed in a tense, rhythmic avoidance. Silas was out before the sun touched the tops of the pines, and he didn't return until the light was gone. Sarah spent the time scouring the house. She scrubbed the floors until the grain of the wood showed through the grime. She washed the heavy wool blankets, and she organized the pantry. She found a crate of old newspapers and used them to line the shelves, noting the cattle prices as she worked. Her hands became rougher, the skin cracking in the dry mountain air, but she felt a strange, budding strength. On the 4th morning, she found the ledger again. She couldn't help herself. She sat at the small desk and began to reconstruct the last 6 months of his accounts. It was worse than she thought. He was being overcharged by the mercantile in town for grain, and he hadn't noticed the discrepancy in his cattle sales from the previous autumn. He was bleeding money through tiny, unseen punctures in his business. By noon, she had a neat list of figures and a plan. When the wagon from the neighboring ranch rolled into the yard, she was ready. The man driving was Pete, a weathered ranch hand who looked at her with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Silas is up at the north fence," he said, tipping his hat. "Just brought over the salt licks he ordered." Sarah walked out to the wagon, her apron white against the brown dust. "I'll take delivery," she said, "and tell Mr. Henderson that we'll be settling the account for the winter feed next week, but we expect the credit for the spoiled hay to be applied first." Pete blinked, his mouth dropping open slightly. "Spoiled hay?" Silas didn't say nothing about. Sarah pulled a piece of paper from her pocket, the numbers neatly aligned. According to the delivery receipts from December, 4 tons were water damaged. Silas might have overlooked it, but I haven't. Tell him we'll be in town on Friday to discuss the balance. Pete tipped his hat again, this time with a touch more respect. "Yes, ma'am, I'll tell him." That evening, Silas found her in the kitchen. He didn't sit down. He stood in the doorway, his presence filling the room. "Pete told me you've been talking to Henderson's men about the hay." Sarah didn't look up from the dough she was kneading. "It was a mistake in the books, Mr. Vane. You were paying for weight you couldn't use." "I've corrected it." Silas took a step forward, his boots heavy on the floor. "I don't need you handling my business." Sarah stopped, her hands covered in flour. "You bought me to make the bank think you were stable," she said, her voice low and even. "A stable man doesn't let his neighbors cheat him out of $40. If I'm to be your wife, even in name, I won't have people thinking I'm married to a man who can't add." Silas stared at her, his eyes narrowed. He looked as if he wanted to argue, to assert his authority, but the logic of her statement was an iron wall. He turned and walked out without another word, but he didn't tell her to stay away from the ledger again. The weeks stretched on, marked by the arrival of a summer that promised to be a scorcher. The creeks began to narrow, and and the tension between Silas and the land grew visible in the deepening lines around his eyes. One afternoon, the sound of an approaching rider broke the midday heat. It was Caleb Thorne, the lawyer who had handled her father's estate. He was a man with a smile that never reached his eyes, a man who built his fortune on the failures of others. Silas stood on the porch, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. "What do you want, Thorne?" Thorne tipped his hat to Sarah, a gesture that felt like a threat. "I'm here on behalf of the Territorial Bank, Silas. Seems there was a clerical error in the Miller estate. The debt wasn't fully satisfied by the sale of the daughter. There's a lingering claim on the Broken Ridge land. Since you married into the debt, the bank is calling for the title as collateral." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her boots. She looked at Silas, expecting to see anger, expecting to see him regret the day he'd bid $50 for her. Instead, he looked at her with a terrifyingly calm intensity. "You're lying," Sarah said, stepping forward. "I read the debt contracts. The sale was a final settlement." Thorne sneered. "The law is a flexible thing, Mrs. Vane. Unless you can produce the original signed release from the bank's regional office, the claim stands." Silas stepped in front of her, his body a solid wall. "Get off my land, Thorne. I'll be in town tomorrow." Thorne laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Bring the deed, Silas. Otherwise, the sheriff will be coming for it." When he rode away, the silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah felt the weight of her father's failures crushing her once more. Every step forward they had taken felt like a delusion. "I'm so sorry, Silas," she whispered. "I didn't know. I never would have let you buy me if I knew it would cost you the ridge." Silas didn't turn around. He stayed looking at the dust Thorne had kicked up. "We'll find a way," he said. "We've fought the weather and the hunger. We'll fight a man in a suit." He finally looked at her, and for the first time, he used her name. Sarah. "We aren't losing this place. Not now. Do you trust me to hold the line while you find the weakness in his paper?" By the fifth morning, the air turned heavy. A week into their arrangement, the first real test of her survival skills arrived. Silas had been gone since dawn, tracking a mountain lion that had been harrying the calves on the high ridge. A sudden, violent spring storm rolled in, the temperature dropping 40 degrees in an hour. Rain turned to sleet, then to a blinding horizontal snow. Sarah knew the livestock in the holding pen near the barn wouldn't survive the night if they weren't moved to the sheltered lean-to. She didn't wait for him. She threw on his old heavy coat, wrapped a scarf around her head, and stepped into the whiteout. The wind tried to knock her flat, the sleet stinging her eyes like needles. She found the calves huddled together, their coats already frosting over. With a rope and a stubbornness she hadn't known she possessed, she began to guide them, one by one, through the waist-deep drifts toward the barn. Her hands were numb, her breath coming in ragged gasps that froze in the air. The mud pulled at her boots, trying to swallow her whole. By the time the last calf was inside, she was shaking so hard she could barely latch the gate. She turned to head back to the house, but the world had disappeared. There was only white. She felt a hand, massive and solid, grab her shoulder. Silas was there, a ghost in the storm. He didn't say a word. He tucked her under his arm, shielding her from the wind with his own body, and marched her back to the porch. Inside, he stripped the frozen coat from her and pushed her toward the stove. "You're a fool," he hissed, though there was no malice in it, only a strange, vibrating tension. Sarah looked up at him, her face red from the cold, her hair plastered to her skull. "The calves are safe," she whispered. Silas looked at her for a long moment, his hand hovering near her cheek, as if he meant to brush away a stray lock of hair. He didn't. He pulled back, his jaw tight. "You could have frozen. I wouldn't have known where to look for you." Sarah saw the flicker of something in his eyes, a genuine fear, a ghost of the loss he carried. "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Vane." He didn't answer, but that night he didn't go to the porch. He sat by the fire, mending a harness, and the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a bridge. It was a fragile bridge, built on the shared knowledge that they were both capable of enduring the unendurable. Does a person ever truly escape the price put on their head, Or are we all just waiting for someone to offer a higher bid for our souls? Sarah watched the firelight dance in Silas's eyes and wondered if he saw a partner or just a debt he had to manage. The weather broke 2 days later, leaving the world sparkling and treacherous. Silas announced they were going to town. He didn't explain why, but Sarah knew. He hitched the team to the buckboard with more care than usual, even wiping the dust from the bench before she climbed up. They pulled up in front of the mercantile, and the town seemed to pause. Sarah climbed down, her chin high, and walked straight to the counter where Mr. Henderson was presiding. Silas followed her, standing a half-step behind her, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked like a thundercloud, but he remained silent, letting her lead. "Mr. Henderson," Sarah said, her voice carrying through the quiet store. "I believe we have an adjustment to make on the Broken Ridge account." Henderson chuckled, a condescending sound. "Now, Mrs. Vane, I'm sure Silas doesn't want you bothering your head with." Silas shifted his weight, the floorboards groaning. "My wife is speaking, Henderson. Listen to her." The store went dead silent. It was the first time Silas had acknowledged her status in public, and the weight of his support was like a physical shield. Sarah laid out the ledger pages, her voice clear and precise. She walked through the overcharges, the spoiled hay, and the interest errors. She showed him the dates, the amounts, and the math that didn't lie. By the time she was finished, Henderson was sweating, his face a mottled red. He looked to Silas for help, but Silas just stared at him with those cold, gray eyes. "Pay the lady," Silas said. Henderson reached into the till and counted out the difference in cash. Sarah took it, tucked it into her glove, and nodded. "Thank you. We'll be needing 2 sacks of flour and a crate of coffee." As they walked back to the wagon, Sarah felt the eyes of the town on her, but they weren't the same eyes that had watched her on the auction block. There was a new, grudging respect there. Silas helped her into the seat, his hand lingering on hers for a second longer than necessary. His palm was warm and calloused, and for the first time, Sarah didn't pull away. On the drive back, the air was different. The tension hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. It was no longer the tension of 2 strangers, but the tension of 2 allies who hadn't yet figured out how to be friends. Silas reached into his pocket and handed her a small peppermint stick he'd bought when she wasn't looking. "For the work," he said. Sarah took it, the sweetness a sharp contrast to the salt and iron of the last few weeks. "Thank you, Silas." He didn't look at her, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. It wasn't a smile, not yet, but it was close. As the weeks passed, the rhythm of the ranch shifted from survival to a shared labor. Silas stopped giving commands and started asking questions. He asked her thoughts on the new breeding stock, and he showed her how to reset a fence post so it wouldn't heave in the frost. He watched her one afternoon as she spent hours tending to a mare with a festering hoof. She hadn't asked for help. She had simply gathered the supplies, boiled the water, and talked to the horse in a low, soothing hum until the animal calmed. Silas stood in the shadows of the barn, watching the way her small hands worked with a precision that rivaled any vet. He saw the grime on her face and the exhaustion in her shoulders, and something in his chest, something long dormant and frozen, began to thaw. He realized she wasn't just surviving the ridge, she was healing it. In return, she showed him how to track the market prices in the San Francisco papers he'd previously ignored, ensuring they sold their steers when the prices peaked. They were a team, even if they hadn't named it. They ate dinner by the light of a single lamp, the conversation sparse but no longer strained. He told her about the drought of '78 and the way the grass had turned to powder. She told him about her mother's garden in the valley and the way the delphiniums looked against the gray sky. They were building a history out of the scraps of their separate tragedies. However, the shadow of Thorne's claim loomed. The following week, Sarah buried herself in the old trunks she'd brought from her father's house. She went through every scrap of paper, every receipt, every legal notice. She searched through old coats, the pockets of her mother's dresses, and the backs of framed photographs. She knew her father was a drunk, but he was also a man who was terrified of losing his pride, and such men often kept meticulous records of their shame. By the light of a flickering kerosene lamp, as the clock ticked toward midnight and the house groaned in the wind, she found it. Tucked inside the lining of an old Bible hidden behind the family tree was a dusty, yellowed envelope. Inside was a handwritten receipt signed by the bank's founder before he'd passed away, acknowledging the full and final payment of the Miller debt through a private sale of land long before Sarah was even born. The debt Thorne was using to claim the ranch had been paid 30 years ago. He was counting on her ignorance. He was counting on the fact that she was just a woman sold at auction. Sarah let out a sob of relief that was half laugh. She didn't wait for morning. She ran out to the barn where Silas was checking the horses, his face lined with a fatigue that broke her heart. "Silas, I found it." He met her halfway across the yard, his face illuminated by the lantern she carried. He read the paper, his jaw tightening as the reality sank in. His hands shook slightly as he held the fragile document. "This makes his claim a fraud," he said. Sarah nodded. "It's more than that. This receipt is from the same bank Thorne represents. If he knew this existed and tried to seize the land anyway, he's committed a crime. I can take this to the circuit judge in the next county over. He won't be in Henderson's pocket." Silas looked at the paper, then at her. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. The way he looked at her, as if she were the most valuable thing he'd ever owned, not because he'd bought her, but because she had earned her place, was enough. "You think you can get there before they come for the deed?" "I know I can," Sarah said, "but I need the fast horse." Silas nodded and began to saddle his best stallion, a beast with a chest like a barrel and legs that never quit. "Go," he said. "I'll keep the sheriff at the gate. If they try to cross the porch, they'll have to go through me." The ride to the next county was 20 miles of brutal terrain, but Sarah pushed the animal with a desperate focus. She rode through the dark, through the creek beds, and over the rocky passes, her mind focused on the paper tucked into her bodice. She arrived at the judge's office just as the sun was rising, her face covered in dust, her hair wild. She presented the evidence with a cold, clear logic that left the judge with no choice. By noon, she had an injunction and an arrest warrant for Thorne. She rode back to the broken ridge as the shadows were lengthening, her heart hammering against her ribs. As she rounded the final bend, she saw the sheriff's wagon in the yard and Thorne standing on the porch, a smug grin on his face. Silas was standing in the doorway, his rifle held loosely across his chest, his expression unreadable. He looked like a man who was ready to die for his home. Sarah didn't stop until she was in the middle of the yard. "Stop!" she cried, waving the legal papers. "Sheriff, read this." The sheriff, a man who had never liked Thorne's predatory ways, took the papers and read them slowly. His face darkened. "Thorne, you're a lying snake. This debt was settled before Sarah was born." He looked up at the lawyer. "I've got a warrant here for your arrest for attempted land theft and fraud. Hand over your belt." Thorne's face turned a sickly shade of gray. He looked at Sarah, then at Silas, his eyes full of a trapped animal's rage. "This isn't over," he screamed as the sheriff hauled him toward the wagon. Silas stepped off the porch, walking slowly toward Sarah. He reached up and took the reins, helping her down from the horse. She was so tired she nearly collapsed into his arms, and for the first time, he didn't let go. He held her against his chest, his heart beating a steady, powerful rhythm against her ear. "You did it," he whispered. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes stinging with tears. "We did it." Silas looked out over the valley, the golden light of the setting sun bathing the broken ridge in a warmth it hadn't seen in years. He looked back at her, his thumb finally brushing the dust from her cheek. "I didn't buy you because I needed a wife for the bank, Sarah." He paused, the words coming with difficulty, but coming nonetheless. "I bid everything I had because I saw you standing up there, and I knew if I didn't take you, the world would break you. And I couldn't let that happen." He took a deep breath, his eyes searching hers. "I'm a hard man, and this is a hard life. But if you'll have me, I'd like to stop being your owner and start being your husband." Sarah didn't need to think. She reached up and pulled his head down, her lips meeting his in a promise that had been building since that first cold day on the auction block. "I think I've already decided on that, Silas." The weeks that followed the arrest of Caleb Thorne were not filled with grand celebrations, but with a quiet, settling peace that felt more permanent than any victory. The town of Bitter Creek had a long memory, and the story of the woman who outmaneuvered the most crooked lawyer in the territory spread like wildfire. When Sarah walked into the mercantile now, the whispers were no longer about her price, but about her prowess. Silas began to change, too. The heavy, suffocating silence that had defined him began to break, replaced by a man who spoke with a purpose. He started building a new addition to the house, a room with large windows that looked out toward the creek. For the light, he said one evening, when she found him measuring the timber. "You need a place for your books." Sarah felt a lump in her throat she couldn't swallow. She hadn't mentioned wanting a library, but he had noticed the way she lingered over the few volumes they owned. Shared labor became their language. They spent the month of June moving the herd to the high summer pastures. It was grueling work, 16-hour days spent in the saddle under a sun that wanted to bake the spirit out of a person. But they worked in a synchronized rhythm. One night, camped under a sky so thick with stars it looked like spilled milk, Silas turned to her. "Why did you come back?" he asked. "After your husband died, you could have stayed east." Sarah looked at the embers of the campfire. "Because the land doesn't lie, Silas. People do. Debt does. But the land is just there. It gives back what you put in. I didn't want a life where I was a decoration in someone's parlor. I wanted a life that I earned." Silas nodded, his eyes reflecting the orange glow of the fire. "You earned this, Sarah, long before you found that paper." By August, the Broken Ridge was thriving. The books were balanced, the cattle were fat, and for the first time in his life, Silas Vane didn't look like a man waiting for the sky to fall. They were sitting on the porch one evening, watching the heat lightning dance over the peaks. Silas reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. He didn't speak, but he didn't have to. The pressure of his palm against hers was a testimony. He pulled a small carved wooden box from his pocket. "I'm not much for words," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "And I've got no right to ask for more than you've already given. But I'd like to make it official. Not for the bank. For us." He opened the box to reveal a ring made of hammered silver, inlaid with a small sky-blue turquoise stone. "I found the stone in the creek when I was a boy," he said. "I've been saving it for something that mattered." Sarah took the ring, the metal cool against her skin. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a reflection of the man who gave it. "It matters, Silas," she whispered. "You matter." She slid the ring onto her finger, and the last of the ghosts that had haunted the Broken Ridge seemed to vanish into the night air. They were married properly by a traveling preacher 2 weeks later in the shade of the ponderosa pines. There were no guests, only the wind and the mountains as witnesses. When the preacher asked Silas if he took Sarah to be his wife, his answer was a single booming "I do" that echoed off the ridges. The summer heat began to mellow into a golden autumn, and the work on the ranch never slowed. There were fences to mend before the first frost and the hay to bring in. Silas spent longer hours in the fields, but now he didn't leave Sarah behind. One afternoon, as they paused for water under the shade of a lone cottonwood, Silas looked at her. Her face was tanned, a deep honey, her hands were calloused, and there was a strength in her eyes that hadn't been there on the auction block. "You're a different woman than the one I brought home, Sarah," he said. Sarah took a long pull from the canteen. "I'm the woman I was always meant to be, Silas. I just needed the space to find her." He nodded, a slow, thoughtful movement. "I reckon I'm a different man, too. They didn't talk about the auction anymore. It was a scar, but scars were just proof that you'd survived. They talked about the future." Late in September, justice finally settled. Caleb Thorne was sentenced to 10 years for fraud. Sarah read the letter aloud as they sat at the kitchen table, the light of the lamp warm against the log walls. "Justice is a slow horse, but it gets there," Silas remarked. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "It's over, Sarah. Truly over." That night, for the first time, Sarah didn't feel the need to check the locks on the doors. She felt safe, not because of the walls or the rifle by the bed, but because of the man who slept beside her. October arrived with a breath of ice that stripped the last of the stubborn gold from the aspens. The peaks of the Tetons, usually jagged shadows against the twilight, were now crowned with a brilliant, blinding white that promised a long and unforgiving season. On the broken ridge, the air had turned crisp and sharp, carrying the metallic scent of impending snow. For Silas and Sarah, this wasn't just a change in the weather, it was a deadline. The rhythm of the ranch shifted from the expansive labors of summer to the frantic, focused preparations of a fortress preparing for a siege. They spent a full week in Bitter Creek, a trip that served as both a practical necessity and a social reckoning. When the buckboard rattled down the main street, the atmosphere was markedly different from that cold April morning when Sarah had been stood upon the block. The town had a way of chewing on gossip until the flavor was gone, but the story of the Vanes had left a lingering aftertaste of awe. As Sarah stepped down from the wagon, her boots hitting the dirt with the confidence of a woman who owned the ground she walked on, the townspeople no longer stared with that hollow, predatory curiosity. Instead, they nodded. The men tipped their hats to her, not out of the polite condescension shown to a widow, but with the deferential air offered to a woman who had faced down Caleb Thorne and won. The women, standing in clusters outside the bakery or the dressmakers, watched her pass with a quiet, reflective intensity. They saw a couple that worked, a couple that endured. They saw the way Silas moved through the mercantile, his hand often settling briefly but firmly on the small of Sarah's back, not as a gesture of possession, but as one of grounding. The most telling moment came on their third day in town. Sarah was deep in the bowels of Henderson's mercantile, cross-referencing their winter supplies against the credits they had recovered from the spring. Henderson himself approached her, leaning his fleshy elbows on the counter. He looked at her neat columns of numbers, the way she had accounted for every pound of salt and every yard of heavy wool. "You've a rare mind for the mathematics of a life, Mrs. Vane," Henderson said, his voice stripped of its usual oily bravado. "To be honest, my books haven't been right since you left the territory the first time. I'm offering a position, 2 days a week, a fair wage in coin, and a discount on all dry goods. It would be an honor to have a Miller, a Vane, handling the ledger again." Sarah looked up from her list. She looked at Henderson, then through the window at Silas, who was loading heavy sacks of grain into the wagon. She felt a flicker of the old Sarah, the one who lived in fear of the next debt, but it was quickly snuffed out by the warmth of her current reality. She smiled, a small, sad, but final movement of her lips, and shook her head. "My books are at the Broken Ridge, Mr. Henderson," she said softly. "Between the herd, the winter stores, and the man I've got waiting for me, I think I've got enough to keep me busy. But I appreciate the offer. It's good to be seen for my mind rather than my price." Silas, standing by the wagon, had caught the tail end of the exchange. He didn't interrupt, but as they walked out to the street, he looked at her with a quiet pride that was more eloquent than any speech. It was in the way he adjusted the seat cushion for her, ensuring she was shielded from the wind, and in the way he handed her the reins for a moment, just so he could watch her steady hands guide the team. The drive back up the mountain was a slow, heavy climb. The wagon was loaded to the brink with the alchemy of survival, barrels of flour, sacks of sugar, crates of coffee, and rolls of heavy, unwashed wool for the spinning wheel. As the sun dipped behind the ridges, casting long, bruised shadows across the trail, the silence between them was no longer the heavy, suffocating thing it had once been. It was full of a shared understanding. They knew the winter would be hard. The high country didn't forgive mistakes. They knew there would be more storms, more trials, and perhaps moments where the hunger would bite. But they also knew, with a certainty that warmed them more than the wool blankets, that they wouldn't face them alone. November brought the first real blizzard, not a mere dusting, but a white wall that slammed into the valley with the force of a physical blow. For 3 days, the world outside the log walls of the Broken Ridge ceased to exist. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the heavy shutters and driving fine needles of snow through the tiniest cracks in the mortar. Inside, however, the house was a sanctuary. The iron stove glowed a dull cherry red, the scent of cedar and roasting coffee filling the air. They fell into a domestic rhythm that felt, to both of them, like a miracle they hadn't dared to pray for. Silas sat by the hearth, his large, calloused hands moving with surprising delicacy, as he used a small knife to carve a set of wooden bowls from a piece of cherry wood he'd saved. Beside him, Sarah worked on the quilt she had started in the heat of June. The pattern was intricate, a A log cabin design, fittingly, and the bright scraps of fabric were a defiant splash of color against the gray world outside. One evening, as the gale reached a crescendo, shaking the very foundations of the house, Silas paused. He laid his knife down and looked around the room. His eyes lingered on the curtains Sarah had sewn, the shelf of books she had organized, and the way the firelight caught the silver of her ring. "I never thought I'd see this house full of anything but ghosts," he said, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the storm. "For 5 years I lived in this room, and never once felt like I was home. It was just a place to wait for the end." Sarah set her needle aside. She looked at the man she had grown to love, not the man who had bought her, but the man who had stood between her and the world. "The ghosts are gone, Silas. We've replaced them. A house is just wood and stone until you put a life inside it." Silas stood up, his massive frame casting a long shadow against the wall. He walked over to her, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw before he pulled her into a slow, lingering kiss. It tasted of wood smoke and a deep, soul-shaking relief. "Thank you, Sarah," he whispered against her hair. "For what?" "For everything. For showing me that a man doesn't have to be a stone to be strong. For making me want to see the spring." The winter was indeed long. There were nights when they had to take turns stoking the fire every 2 hours to keep the pipes from bursting. There were mornings when Silas had to dig a tunnel through the snow just to reach the barn to feed the shivering cattle. But through every frost-bitten hour, there was a sense of purpose. They were no longer two people thrown together by a judge's gavel. They were a foundation. They spent their evenings talking, really talking. Silas told her about his father's dream for the ridge and how it had nearly broken him. Sarah told her about her husband's passing and the hollow years that followed. They shared their secrets like tinder, using them to keep the fire of their companionship burning. By the time the spring thaw arrived, the broken ridge had undergone a transformation that was more than structural. The new room Silas had built during the mild spells was finally finished. It was Sarah's sanctuary, a room with large windows to catch the morning sun, filled with her books and a small, sturdy table where they sat every morning to plan their day. The ledger lived there now, no longer a record of debt, but a diary of growth. They had survived the winter, and as the snow retreated, it revealed a land that was thirsty and ready. As the first green shoots began to poke through the softening earth, Sarah stood on the porch, wrapped in a light shawl. The air was sweet with the scent of damp soil and melting ice. She looked out over the valley and saw the cattle grazing in the lower pasture, their coats shaggy but their spirits high. She saw the smoke rising from the chimney, a steady signal of life. Then she saw Silas riding toward her on the big stallion. He looked up and waved, his face breaking into a genuine, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. Sarah waved back, her heart feeling almost too large for her chest. She thought back to that day on the auction block, the cold, the fear, and the absolute humiliation of being priced like a heifer. It felt like a lifetime ago, a story belonging to another woman in another world. She looked at her hands, rough and capable. She wasn't a liability. She wasn't livestock. She was a partner, a builder, and a woman who had found her own strength in the middle of a wilderness that had once tried to swallow her whole. Silas pulled the horse to a stop at the edge of the porch and climbed down, his spurs jingling softly. He looked at the rushing water of the nearby stream, swollen with snowmelt. "The creek is running high," he said, leaning against the railing, "higher than I've seen it in years. We'll have plenty of water for the garden this year. No need to worry about a drought." Sarah stepped down from the porch and met him in the yard, her feet sinking slightly into the rich, waking mud. She reached out and took his hand, her thumb tracing the familiar calluses. "I already planted the delphiniums, Silas," she said, looking toward the patch of earth near the new window, right where they can see the sun. "They're the first things that will bloom." He put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her into the solid warmth of his side. He looked at the land, then at her, his expression one of profound peace. "They'll grow fine, Sarah. Everything grows fine here now. The shadows of the past, the debts, the losses, the silence, had finally been outbid by the light of their shared future. The broken ridge was no longer a place of ghosts. It was a place of beginnings, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most desperate bargains lead to the most sacred of bonds. And as the moon rose over the Tetons, casting a silver glow over their kingdom, Sarah knew with every fiber of her being that she hadn't been sold at all. She had been found. She had been chosen. And finally, she was home.